There is a moment when the silence becomes so thick it seems to breathe. It is in that instant that something breaks. Not outside, but inside. And when the sound of the world returns, it is no longer the same. The soul, now wounded by its own consciousness, awakens. Everything that was once routine becomes an enigma. The air, the light, the body, time, everything becomes an unanswered question. It is the first sign that the journey has begun. Carl Jung said that man only becomes real when wounded by his own destiny, and perhaps it's true. Perhaps the beginning of every transformation comes accompanied by an invisible fracture, a crack on the surface of the self. We are taught to fear this rupture, to flee from the pain and the abyss it opens. But it is precisely there, at that point where the soul bleeds, that something divine begins to breathe. Think about it. What if there was nothing to fix? What if pain wasn't a flaw, but a passage? For years we've been taught to hide our imperfections, to wear masks that shine brighter than our faces. We've learned to disguise fear, to deny tiredness, to stifle the inner cry that demands authenticity. And then, from pretending to be whole for so long, we forget the sound of what it is to be true. We forget that the human being is made of cracks, and that it is through them that the essential manifests itself. Jung understood that the unconscious is not an enemy, but an unexplored continent. Within it lie monsters and gods, shadows and lights, ruins and seeds. When we dare to look inside and see what is hidden there, we cease to be spectators of life and become its creators. But the price is high. To look inside is to see the mirror shatter. It is to recognize that the hero we dreamed of being also harbors the traitor, the coward, the desperate. The human being is not simple, and what we call damaged may only be what is being shaped by the invisible. Society teaches that strength lies in remaining intact. But what is wholeness if not an illusion of control? The perfect vase doesn't let the light in. The wall without cracks doesn't allow the wind to pass through. The heart that never breaks doesn't learn to love. Everything that lives because it opens itself, because it accepts the risk of vulnerability. The same is true for the soul. It needs to break open to expand. It needs to die to be reborn. There is an almost cruel beauty in this paradox. The wound, which seems to diminish us, is actually the gateway to something greater than ourselves. Jung called this the individuation process, the continuous movement of integration between light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, human and divine. It is a solitary path, often dark, but inevitable for those who wish to exist fully. And each step on this path demands courage. The courage to lose what we thought we were, to find what we truly are. But I ask, who truly desires to see themselves in their entirety? Who bears the weight of their own truth? Many prefer the comfortable illusion, the social role, the domesticated persona. It's simpler to maintain the mask than to confront the face it conceals. Yet something within us insists on awakening. There's an ancient restlessness, an almost forgotten memory that we are more than the story we tell. This memory is the call, and the call does not cease. One day, without warning, it arrives. It may come in the form of loss, illness, or inexplicable failure. It may come as an impossible love or devastating loneliness. What matters is not the form, but the impact. The call tears the veil of normality and reveals the abyss that has always been there. It is at this moment that many go mad, others give up, and few decide to continue. Those who continue know there is no turning back. The old identity crumbles, and the soul begins to forge a new order within the chaos. Jung said that light only shines where there is shadow. There is no enlightenment without dissent, without confrontation, without radical surrender to what we fear most within ourselves. Every fear is a mirror of what we have not yet loved. Every fall, a lesson in humility. Every pain, an invitation to expansion. The universe does not rush, it bends us until we learn to flow with the mystery. There is a serenity that arises when we stop resisting, when we understand that pain is not a punishment, but a language, that each wound carries a secret meaning, a symbol waiting to be deciphered. Jung saw symbols as bridges between the visible and the invisible, expressions of the soul that the intellect cannot comprehend, only feel. Therefore, the one who suffers is being instructed by an ancient wisdom, even if they don't realize it. And perhaps that's why the most sensitive always seem the most damaged, not because they are fragile, but because they are more open to the truth. They perceive the world's fissures, hear the sound of the invisible, feel the collective pain. They are receptacles of the unconscious, broken vessels through which the sacred flows. Humanity has always needed them, even when it rejects them. They are the ones who walk on the border between lucidity and delirium, between reason and mystery. When Jung wrote about modern man in search of a soul, he knew he was talking about all of us. We live surrounded by technology, information, and distractions, but lacking meaning. Progress has given us speed, but it has robbed us of direction. We run, but we don't know where to. We desire, but we don't know what. The forgotten soul murmurs in dreams, in symptoms, in small signs that we try to ignore, but it persists, like an underground beat echoing in the silent early mornings. What if what we call suffering is merely the soul's attempt to awaken us? What if every failure is a push for consciousness to expand? What if life, in its apparent cruelty, is actually a compassionate teacher, dismantling everything that is not essential? When we understand this, something changes. Pain ceases to be the enemy. We begin to see it as a messenger, as the voice of a greater process. It is the beginning of transmutation. The lead of suffering begins to turn into the gold of wisdom. It is not a sudden miracle, but a slow inner metamorphosis. And what emerges from this transformation is a more whole being, not because it is healed, but because it has learned to love its own scars. In the end, it's simple, and at the same time, immense. The cracks we fear are the same ones through which the light enters. The wound is the door. The fall is the beginning of the ascent. Chaos is the womb of creation. But few are ready to cross that threshold. Most hesitate, turn back, try to piece together the fragments of their former life. However, there is always a moment, a flash of lucidity, when the being realizes that resistance is futile, that the calling is stronger than fear, that the abyss, however dark it may seem, holds the first glimpse of dawn, and it is precisely there, at that point of silent surrender, that the true journey begins. There was a time when I believed everything was under control. I woke up early, followed a precise routine, met deadlines, and believed that effort alone was enough to keep the world in order. I prided myself on this discipline, like someone who believes they've built an inner fortress. But just one moment, one word, one absence is enough for the ground to crumble beneath your feet. Life doesn't ask permission when it decides to strip us of the illusion of control. And when that happens, we discover there is no fortress at all, only a naked body facing the wind. Carl Jung said that what we resist persists, and it was only when I stopped resisting that I realized what had really happened to me. Everything I called stability was just fear disguised as virtue. I feared chaos, I feared losing, I feared being seen in my fragility. Like so many others, I built my life trying to avoid falling, until it became inevitable. And when I finally fell, I realized that the abyss was not the end but the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. In the beginning there is anger. Anger at what was lost. Anger at those who hurt us. Anger at fate itself. Then comes despair, the fear of never being the same again. We try to restore what was destroyed, as if the past could be glued back together, but nothing fits. The person we were no longer exists. And it is at this point, when every attempt to go back fails, that the soul begins to learn the art of surrender. There is something profoundly human in this process. The woman who loses her job and feels her dignity slipping through her fingers. The man who sees love leave and doesn't understand why. The young man who tries to meet impossible expectations and silently collapses in a dark room. Everyone at some point experiences the fall, and everyone believes it is punishment, but it isn't. It's a calling. Jung described life as a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, a theater where the hidden forces of the soul reveal themselves in every crisis. Unemployment, the end of a love affair, a mistake that shames us. All these are merely ways in which the unconscious calls us to look inward. What hurts is not the event itself, but what it awakens. The wound is not in the event, but in the meaning it forces us to confront. I remember a woman who, after a devastating divorce, said she felt like an abandoned house. There are echoes everywhere, she told me, and every corner reminds me of what is no longer there. For months, she tried to fill the void with distractions. Travel, social media, new relationships, but nothing lasted. It was only when she began to talk to loneliness, to treat it as a living presence, that something changed. She began writing letters to herself, and in them she discovered that the absence of the other was a mirror of her own absence. The love she sought outside was the love she didn't know how to give to her own heart. This is precisely where the mystery begins, the moment when suffering ceases to be a curse and becomes a master. Jung stated that what we deny dominates us, and what we accept transforms us. This woman, like so many of us, needed to descend into the basement of her soul to find what she had left locked away. There lay the fear of being forgotten, repressed hatred, the desire for control. But alongside these shadows, there was also a dormant power, the capacity to create meaning, even from nothing. And that's what the damage truly does. It awakens us. When the world collapses, when there are no more certainties, something older begins to act within us. Let's call it the soul, instinct, divine spark. The name matters little. What matters is that it knows the way, even when the ego is lost. The fall teaches us to float. Think of water. When we fight against it, we sink. When we surrender, it sustains us. Life is like that too. While we try to control it, it slips away from us. But when we relax, when we accept the flow, something unexpected happens. We are carried away. Trust, which once seemed impossible, becomes natural. The damaged person learns to trust not out of naivete, but out of exhaustion. They discover that control is a fragile illusion, and that true power lies in knowing when to let go. A man I knew, after losing everything in a fire, told me he spent weeks sleeping in his car. At first, he felt shame, anger, despair. But with time, something changed. I realized the world hadn't ended, he said. I was still breathing. There were still stars. There was still music on the radio. And I realized that for the first time I was truly living. What he called ruin was, in fact, the birth of a new consciousness. Homeless, he found shelter within himself. This is the paradox of pain. It destroys in order to reveal. Every loss is a disguised initiation, and each of us at some point will be called upon to traverse this dark night. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It is in the shadows that the living symbols of the soul move. They visit us in dreams, in coincidences, in small signs that we only perceive when we stop running. One night, while walking alone, I noticed something strange. There was a smell of damp earth in the air, and the moon was partially hidden by clouds. I felt a presence, as if silence itself were watching me. It was then that I understood. There is no loneliness when we learn to listen. All of nature speaks to those who have already broken inside. The wind, the distant sound of a train, the murmur of the city, everything becomes language. It's as if the universe, out of compassion, begins to whisper, "Now you can hear me." The person who hasn't yet been broken by life doesn't understand this. They live in tension, trying to avoid any crack, as if they could escape the fate common to all. But when something finally breaks, they discover a new kind of strength, not the strength of the invincible, but that of the flexible. Like ancient wood that has already faced 1,000 storms, they learn to bend without breaking. To be damaged is to understand that we are not the absolute protagonists of anything. We are part of something vast, a plot that unfolds with or without our consent. When we realize this, a luminous humility arises. The ego, once sovereign, learns to be silent. And in that silence, the invisible begins to act. Daily life will never be the same after this. Small gestures gain depth. Breakfast in silence, a stranger's gaze on the subway, the rain on the window. Everything becomes symbolic. Life, once banal, reveals itself as sacred, because the one who has fallen and returned knows that everything is fleeting, including pain. However, there is a decisive moment in this process. It is the instant when the being understands that there is no turning back, that the old self is dead and the new one has not yet been born. It is a threshold, a space between worlds. It is there that many give up, because the void seems endless. But it is precisely there that the invisible works in silence, shaping what cannot yet be seen. And then, suddenly something changes. There are no fireworks or revelations. It's a different kind of stillness, a peace that comes without explanation. It's the moment when the soul, tired of fighting, finally trusts. The wound becomes a scar, and the scar a map. Damage transforms into wisdom. This is how human beings are reborn, not as those who return to what they were, but as those who discover what they were always destined to be. And yet there is a secret that few dare to confront. What happens after surrender? Because when the soul accepts the darkness, something much deeper awakens in the shadows. Something that watches, that calls, that waits. Something that not even the light fully comprehends. And it is there, in that invisible territory, that the true metamorphosis begins to take shape. There comes a moment when the silence of the soul changes tone. It is no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something beginning to be born. After the fall and surrender comes a strange serenity, not the kind sought in forced meditations or promises of instant self-knowledge, but a profound, almost wild stillness that arises when there is nothing left to defend. It is the point at which the human being begins, for the first time, to live without the mask of resistance. Carl Jung said that life wants to live through us, and it is only when we stop fighting that it finally does. At first, this state seems dangerous. The mind despairs without control. It cries out, "What if nothing works out? What if I'm just giving up?" But something older silently replies, "Let it be." This is how the principle of non-forcing is born. It's not giving up, it's maturity. It's when the ego, tired of trying to control destiny, understands that the current of life knows better than it does. He who has tasted pain learns that control is a disguised form of fear, and when that fear dissolves, the flow begins. But what really happens when we stop resisting? What emerges when the body and mind, exhausted from the struggle, surrender completely to reality? That's when life reveals its own rhythm. Things stop being forced and begin to happen naturally. A word arrives at the right time. An encounter changes the course of a day. A dream becomes an answer. Synchronicity, which Jung spoke so much about, becomes visible. The universe, silent and patient, responds only when we stop shouting. There is no more effort, there is communion. It's as if the soul finally remembers that it was never alone. I once heard a man say, "I discovered that the most important things in my life happened when I had already given up." He wasn't talking about discouragement, but about surrender. He was talking about the night when, tired of fighting his own anxiety, he simply sat down and cried. The next day, without planning it, he met a friend he hadn't seen in years. And from that reunion came the work that would change his whole life. Was it a coincidence? Or does life only act when we stop trying to control it? But if everything flows, why do we still insist on holding on? Why do we fear surrender so much, when it is from surrender that lightness comes? Jung said that pride is the ego's last refuge, and pride wears 1,000 disguises: responsibility, rationality, prudence. In the name of all this, we become rigid. We want to guarantee results, avoid risks, predict outcomes. But those who live like this never experience the mystery. The damaged, the already broken, have learned through pain that security is a fiction, and therefore live with more truth. They trust not because they are optimistic, but because they have seen the worst and survived. This surrender, however, does not make us passive. On the contrary, it awakens a new form of action. It is what Jung would call collaboration with the unconscious, acting in conjunction with what life wants, and not against it. The person who lives in this state seems to act with lightness, but their lightness comes from a silent strength, not from carelessness. They act when they feel the moment is right and remain silent when the moment demands waiting. There is power in this subtle obedience to what is invisible. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to attract coincidences? They talk about something and, on the same day, the opportunity arises. They think of someone and the phone rings. It's not magic, it's synchronicity. They've stopped separating themselves from life. What they want and what happens have become one and the same. That's the secret the damaged one discovers. When we stop forcing things, the world begins to conspire. But not everyone understands this immediately. The modern mind fears silence, confusing surrender with apathy. It believes that only effort brings merit. We are taught to conquer, not to cooperate, to think that the universe is something to be overcome, not something we dance with. However, the damaged mind has learned the opposite, that the highest power is born from surrender. Why is it so hard to believe that life knows what it's doing? The answer may lie in the ancestral fear of disappearing. The ego fears being forgotten, fears that without control it will cease to exist. But when the ego is silent, something much greater manifests. A different kind of compassion emerges, not one that is displayed, but one that recognizes suffering as a common language among all beings. The wounded person sees the pain in the eyes of others and sees themselves there. They don't offer advice, they offer presence. They don't try to heal the other. They simply listen, and that in itself is healing. There is a profound delicacy in those who have suffered and understood. Those who have traversed despair learn to treat the world with care. They know the weight of a word, the value of silence. They no longer judge so easily, because they know human frailty within themselves. And it is this vulnerability that makes them wise. Jung saw compassion as a form of individuation. The self, by integrating its shadows, recognizes that there is no separation between its own suffering and the suffering of the world. But there is a subtle danger here. Damage can become imprisonment. Pain can transform into identity. When this happens, the being poisons itself with its own past. Learning becomes lament, and the wound, a shield. Therefore, true awakening is not merely accepting the damage, but transforming it into a passage. Have you ever wondered if sometimes it's not the very attachment to pain that keeps you trapped? Suffering has a strange allure. It gives us history, makes us special, sets us apart. But Jung warned that suffering is not to be worshipped. It is to be understood. The soul that remains attached to pain refuses the call of healing. And healing is not forgetting. It is transmutation. It is looking to the past and seeing beauty where before there was only weight. It is recognizing that what has departed has fulfilled its purpose and then moving on. One day, inevitably, the question that decides everything arrives. What will I do with what has happened to me? This question separates those who become bitter from those who become wise. The bitter person sees life as an enemy. The wise person recognizes it as an ally. The first says, "Why me?" The second says, "What for me?" And this small change of preposition transforms the entire destiny. Have you ever noticed how a simple question can change the course of an entire life? It is at this point that the being is reborn in depth. It is no longer the sum of its wounds, but the alchemist who has transformed them into gold. It discovers that its purpose is not to escape pain, but to reveal the hidden meaning within it. And when this revelation happens, a silent light begins to radiate. It is the same light that Jung said emerges from the unconscious when consciousness opens to listen to it, not as a theory, but as a living presence. This light does not promise the absence of suffering, but fullness within it. It does not promise an easy path, but a real path. And it is in this reality, in this imperfect and sacred ground, that the human being rediscovers the divine. However, there is something even deeper waiting ahead, something that not even the light can immediately reveal. Because when the being opens itself fully to the mystery, a new voice begins to emerge from the depths of the soul, a voice that belongs neither to the ego, nor to memory, nor to fear, an ancient voice that speaks before words. And when it manifests, nothing is ever the same again. There is a moment in life when something within us begins to awaken irreversibly. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a whisper from a distant place. But soon this whisper becomes a presence. It is the self, as Carl Jung described it, the invisible center of the psyche, the divine core that organizes and guides our existence without the ego realizing it. This center, however, can only emerge when the surface of the self breaks. The ego, which believed it controlled everything, is forced to acknowledge its powerlessness in the face of the mystery. And it is at this point that the new being begins to be born. It often happens in improbable ways. Some feel it amidst the chaos of traffic, on an ordinary morning, when suddenly the mind falls silent and the world seems suspended. Others perceive it after a tragedy, when despair reaches its peak and inexplicably, a peace without origin arises. It's as if life, after so much destruction, finally reveals itself in its essence. A man who spent years trying to erase his own history of failures and vices recounted that one night, seeing the reflection of his face in a puddle of rain, he felt something looking back. It wasn't regret, nor delirium. It was recognition. For the first time, he saw himself whole, with all his ruins, but also with a living spark in the center of the darkness. It was there, he said, that I realized I had never been alone. Why does revelation choose precisely the moments when we are most vulnerable? Why does the self only manifest when the ego surrenders? Jung believed that the unconscious is not a repository of weaknesses, but the place where creative forces sleep. He said that the human soul is like a forest, dense, dark, and fertile. To cross it, courage is needed. It is in this shadowy territory that the images that shape us are found, the archetypes, and it is through them that the self begins to communicate. Sometimes it comes in dreams, an old house with locked doors, a wounded animal, a mirror covered in mist. Other times it manifests itself in seemingly banal events that somehow seem laden with meaning. It is not coincidence, it is dialogue. A certain woman, after years of struggling with an inexplicable feeling of emptiness, began having a recurring dream, a bird trapped in an open cage, which, even free to fly, remained motionless. She would wake up with her heart racing, without understanding. When the dream repeated itself for the 5th time, she decided to write it down in detail. In that simple act, something was revealed. The bird was herself. The cage door had always been open, but she still believed she needed permission to leave. This realization was the beginning of her liberation, not symbolic, but real. She left the job that suffocated her and began the artistic work she had always postponed. "The cage never existed outside of me," she later wrote. "How many times have you also remained inside a prison that was already open?" The self speaks like this, in vivid metaphors, in subtle gestures that demand listening, but the ego rarely listens. It wants explanations, it wants guarantees. You want to know what will come next, and the self doesn't respond with logic, it responds with destiny. When it awakens, the course of things begins to change. People leave our lives without warning. Paths that seemed certain close. Other doors open effortlessly. Everything seems to lose meaning until we realize that the old meaning no longer serves us. It's a necessary dismantling, the deconstruction of the old self so that the new can emerge. This is what happened to an engineer who, after a near-fatal accident, spent months recovering. During that time, he began to draw to alleviate his boredom. Gradually, he realized there was something sacred in that gesture. He didn't draw to show anyone, but to understand what he felt. When he returned to normal life, he was no longer the same. He abandoned his technical career and dedicated himself to art, without regrets. When asked if he wasn't afraid to start over, he replied, "After you die and come back, fear loses its voice." What if fear was merely the last guardian before the revelation? There is something profoundly liberating about crossing one's own limits. What once seemed fatal becomes proof of rebirth. Jung saw this process as the journey of the inner hero, not the hero of victories, but the one who descends into the depths of the soul and returns transformed. This journey, however, is unpredictable. Sometimes it seems that everything gets worse before it gets better. The unconscious reorganizes life in its own way, dismantling what no longer serves. It is a process that defies linear time and rational logic. Life begins to operate in circular patterns, spirals that lead us to revisit old pains in a new light. There are also curious phenomena that occur at this stage. People report feeling a strange expansion of perception, as if the world had become more alive. Colors seem more intense, sounds clearer, encounters more meaningful. Jung called this the numinous, the direct experience of mystery. The numinous is not a visible miracle, but the feeling of being in contact with something greater, a force that transcends explanation. It is not about religion, but about presence. The individual feels that everything is connected, that each small event participates in a larger design. But there is a risk, believing that awakening is the end of the road. Consciousness does expand, yes, but it remains human, and the human, even when enlightened, still carries a shadow. Jung warned that the closer we get to the light, the longer the shadow becomes behind us. The spiritualized ego can become even more dangerous than the ordinary ego because it believes itself to be pure. Therefore, the true work never ends. Individuation is an eternal movement, a dance between light and darkness, between consciousness and mystery. Have you ever noticed how life tests us precisely when we think we've already learned? A man who dedicated decades to the study of spirituality once confessed that his greatest learning came from a moral failing. "I believed I was beyond temptation," he said, "but life showed me otherwise. When I finally fell, I realized that humility is the true state of grace." He didn't lose his faith, but transformed it. He discovered that the divine doesn't demand perfection, it demands truth. And it is this truth that the self seeks in us, not the truth of words, but the truth of being. The self doesn't want us to be good, it wants us to be whole. It leads us back to wholeness, where love and fear coexist, where fragility is not weakness but a form of connection. The individual who reaches this state becomes free, not because nothing affects them anymore, but because nothing dominates them anymore. At this point, something rare happens. The person begins to radiate a silent presence that effortlessly transforms others. They don't need to teach or convince. Their existence becomes a testament. Jung said that the individual in contact with the self is like a lit candle in the darkness. It doesn't illuminate by intention, but by nature. But something even more mysterious approaches. When this light begins to expand, a new question arises. What happens when the self, this inner center, tries to communicate not only with the individual, but with the world? When the soul awakens in many at the same time? What is born when several sparks decide to recognize each other? Perhaps the next stage of humanity lies precisely at this invisible point, where individual pain transforms into collective consciousness, and personal harm reveals itself as the seed of a new way of existing. What if what we call personal healing is actually the beginning of healing for the whole world? There comes a moment when everything changes, not because the outside world transforms, but because the inner gaze awakens. The person who has accepted their flaws, who no longer tries to hide their own cracks, begins to perceive something extraordinary. Their pain ceases to be a burden and becomes a bridge. It's as if by revealing their wounds, they open a path for others to recognize themselves as well. Carl Jung said that nothing unites us as much as shared suffering, and perhaps that's why vulnerability has the power to heal. When a human being allows themselves to be seen in their truth, they authorize others to do the same. This revelation is silent, yet transformative. There's no need to speak much anymore. Simply existing authentically is enough. People perceive when someone carries within them a different kind of strength, a strength that doesn't come from resistance, but from surrender. It's the serenity of someone who has already traversed chaos and survived, who knows pain without fear, and has learned to walk with it. This presence changes the atmosphere of a room, alters the energy of a conversation, ignites an invisible flame in those around. But there's something no one mentions. This light awakens unpredictable reactions. Some approach with gratitude, others shy away with discomfort. Truth, when embodied, is not always welcome. Many still fear the mirror it offers. It's common for the awakened being to find themselves isolated again, no longer out of despair, but out of difference. And it is in this new kind of solitude that the final test takes place. Have you ever been afraid to show who you really are, even after everything you've been through? A soul healed by truth no longer fits into the masks of the past. It realizes that pretending would be betraying its own learning. Even so, there are moments when the temptation to return to the old role arises. The role of the strong, the productive, the everything's fine, but something inside prevents it. The acquired awareness is irreversible. The healed wound does not forget what it has learned. Authenticity becomes not just an ideal, but a vital necessity. It is at this point that the unexpected happens. When the soul no longer seeks recognition, the world begins to listen. Strangers approach to tell their stories, as if they sense a safe space there. The suffering of others finds an echo in the silence of what has been transformed. This is how true empathy is born. Not the pity that looks down, but the compassion that recognizes the equality of all. The wounded, healed soul becomes a living mirror, reflecting pain, but also hope. Once, a man who had overcome years of profound loneliness began frequenting a cafe every day, without any particular intention. He would simply sit and watch people go by. Gradually, regulars began to sit next to him, first by chance, then by choice. Without realizing it, he had become a meeting point. He didn't talk much, he just listened. When someone asked him why so many sought him out, he replied, "Because I've been where they are, and I survived." That is true alchemy, transforming pain into presence. But the process doesn't end there. When pain transforms into wisdom, the world around us begins to mirror this movement. Jung believed that the individual psyche and the collective unconscious are like mirrors in constant communication. When a being transforms, a part of humanity changes with them. It's as if each awakened soul is a spark igniting others in the dark. Small waves of consciousness begin to spread silently. Suddenly, ideas of compassion, freedom, and truth begin to emerge in different parts of the world, without anyone knowing who started them. Is it a coincidence? Or are we witnessing a collective awakening, still invisible to the common eye? Perhaps that is precisely what the self desires, to expand through humanity, to unite what was fragmented. And when this force begins to act, everything accelerates. People who have never met feel the same anxieties, ask the same questions, seek the same meaning. It is as if the collective unconscious were vibrating at a new frequency. The chaos we see in the world may simply be a reflection of this inner reordering. Disorder is the harbinger of transformation, but every birth is also a collapse. The old order resists. The collective ego, accustomed to dominating, fears dissolution. Conflicts, polarizations, and irrational fears arise. The old world screams, trying to remain whole. However, the new has already begun, and nothing can stop it. Jung said that humanity evolves not through reason, but through the expansion of consciousness. Each individual who awakens contributes to this expansion, even without realizing it. What if all of humanity's current suffering is a sign that something greater is emerging? Imagine millions of people discovering, almost simultaneously, that they are not alone, that the emptiness they feel is the same emptiness that pulsates in the hearts of others, that their pain is not failure, but the language of the same universal process. This realization would change everything. Fear would lose its power. Compassion would cease to be the exception. Competition would give way to collaboration. Humanity would begin to remember what it has always been: one body, breathing with the same invisible heart. But for this to happen, each person must go through their own dark night and emerge from it without forgetting the path. The wounded awakened one becomes a guardian of the human process. They don't speak of easy hope, because they know that rebirth hurts. But their mere presence says, "I survived and you can too." This testimony is what truly transforms the world. Not speeches, not promises, but the silent example of those who have lived what they teach. And then the final paradox emerges. The individual who once felt fragmented realizes that they were always part of something whole. The pain that seemed personal was merely the universe's way of making space within them for the collective to flourish. Each scar is a portal, each loss a seed. The soul that accepts this becomes a vehicle for something greater. There comes a moment when fear completely dissolves, not because the danger has disappeared, but because the individual realizes that what truly matters cannot be destroyed. Everything external, status, success, recognition, loses its luster. Value now lies in something else, in authenticity, in communion, in living presence. It is the stillness of one who knows they no longer need to prove anything to the world, but it is precisely at this point of peace that destiny usually brings the final test. It is the return to ordinary life, to the everyday. It is easy to feel enlightened in solitude. The real challenge is to remain awake amidst the noise. The self does not seek to create isolated monks, but whole beings who walk among others. The work is not to escape the world, it is to transform it from within. What if the real miracle is remaining human after all? This is the culmination of the journey, discovering that perfection was never the goal, but a fully lived reality. That the universe never intended flawless beings, but real beings. The wounded who accepts it, the healed who still feels, the strong who admits weakness. This is the new archetype of the human being that is approaching. Carl Jung said that life wants to flourish through us, and now we understand what he meant. There is no longer I and others. There is only a living web, pulsating in every gesture, in every look, in every act of silent courage. Damage is not an obstacle, it is a passage. The wound is the altar, and what we called the end is, in fact, the beginning of a new way of existing, because at its core, it has always been the same calling, to allow light to enter through the cracks, and, from that light, to let the world that does not yet exist be born. There comes a moment when life ceases to be a quest and becomes a calling, a silent, profound calling that doesn't come from outside, but from within, from the same place where pain once resided. This is the end point and, at the same time, the true beginning. After so many falls, so many attempts to fix what seemed irreparable, the human being realizes something essential. They no longer need to pretend to be whole. Authenticity, this rare form of courage, replaces all masks. It is the moment when we stop pursuing perfection and begin to truly live. Carl Jung said that we don't become enlightened by imagining the light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's exactly what we learn when we stop running away from what hurts us. The wound, once a source of shame, reveals itself as a portal. It's no longer something to be hidden, but something to be understood. Pain, when accepted, transforms into wisdom. Fragility, when exposed, becomes a bridge. The fall, when understood, becomes a direction. Everything changes when we stop resisting who we are and begin to listen to what life has been trying to tell us for so long. But how do you apply this to the real world? To everyday life where bills don't wait, time is short, and fear returns every morning. The secret lies in small gestures, repeated with intention. Start by observing yourself without judgment. When you feel anger, fear, or tiredness, instead of rejecting these feelings, embrace them. Ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to show me? This simple question opens up space for awareness to enter where before there was only reaction. Change begins there, not in the external world, but in the instant we choose to look inward with kindness. The second practice is presence. When you are talking to someone, truly listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. Perceive the other person as an extension of yourself. Each person who crosses your path is a different version of the same mystery trying to understand itself. This exercise dissolves isolation and creates invisible bonds. And these bonds are the true antidote to loneliness. Jung called this a soul relationship, the encounter in which two consciousnesses recognize each other as parts of the same totality. The third step is accepting imperfection as a path. Stop seeing mistakes as failures and start treating them as teachers. Each mistake reveals a blind spot in the soul that cries out for light. When we react with humility, the mistake becomes a lesson. When we react with pride, it repeats itself. Therefore, when you fall, tell yourself, life is teaching me something I haven't yet understood. This change of perspective transforms pain into a tool and failure into evolution. But there is an even deeper aspect that needs to be remembered. What you call you is not just this story that began at your birth. Within each being there is something that has never been wounded, a silent, luminous, and immutable center. Jung called this the self, the point where human consciousness touches the divine. This center doesn't need to be created or conquered, only recognized. It reveals itself in moments of silence, contemplation, and surrender. It's that inexplicable feeling of peace that appears when we stop trying to control everything. When you act from this place, life ceases to be war and becomes dance. Perhaps now you're wondering, what if I can't do it? What if I continue to feel broken, insecure, small? The answer is simple, and at the same time transformative. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The path doesn't demand perfection, it demands sincerity. The soul doesn't expect you to be ready to begin. It only asks that you begin. Take the first step, even if you're trembling. Speak, even if you're afraid. Feel, even if you don't understand. Transformation doesn't come from the absence of flaws, but from the courage to continue despite them. Remember, light is not born from force, but from openness. Just as a cracked vase lets light through, a broken heart allows life to shine through it. Perfection is a wall. Vulnerability is a window. When you accept your cracks, you become part of the natural movement of existence. The universe doesn't need flawless beings. It needs true beings. People who feel, make mistakes, cry, and yet continue. Because it is in this continuity that grace resides. One day, inevitably, you will realize that everything you've lived through, every loss, every fall, every despair, was part of the same design. Nothing was in vain. What seemed like chaos was merely the secret work of the soul, breaking down old structures so that something new could be born. And what emerges from this process is not a new you, but the same you, finally whole. The pain only removed what was not essential. What remains is what was always true. At that moment, life changes tone. The world is still the same, the streets, the sounds, the people, but something within you sees everything differently. Every glance becomes a mirror, every gesture a symbol, every breath a silent prayer. Existence ceases to be about survival and becomes a celebration. There is no more hurry, because time is now an ally. There is no more fear, because even fear has a purpose. Everything is in service of the expansion of consciousness. And then comes the moment of choice. Not a dramatic choice, but an intimate and definitive one. The choice to live with presence, to act with truth, to be a bridge between what suffers and what awakens. You already have everything you need. There is nothing to seek outside. The treasure you have always sought is buried within you, waiting for the moment of listening. Carl Jung said that the true meaning of life is to become who you are. Now you understand. Becoming who you are doesn't mean going back to being the same as before, but revealing what has always existed beneath the masks. It means living without hiding the scars and without needing to prove any worth. It means understanding that love is not a reward, but the very natural state of being. So if there's one thing you can do right now, at this very moment, it's to take a deep breath and decide that you're not going to postpone your own truth any longer. Speak what you feel. Forgive what still hurts. Embrace what remains. Stop trying to seem strong and allow yourself to be real. The world needs real people. People who, instead of hiding their wounds, transform them into paths for others. People who walk with humility, but with firmness because they know that what guides them is greater than any fear. And when discouragement returns, because it will, remember, the process continues. Every time you choose to remain conscious, something within the world also awakens. Your courage to be who you are gives permission for others to be free as well. And so, little by little, the invisible transforms into collective strength. The journey that began with pain ends with purpose. You are the vessel the universe chose, not because you are perfect, but because you are open, and it is through your cracks that the light enters, and through them that it spreads. If something in this script resonated with you, if any part touched a point that still resonates with you, share it. Write in the comments, even anonymously. Your voice can be the mirror of someone who still feels alone. Like, subscribe to the channel, and help this message reach those who still need to hear that there is nothing wrong with being human. Because being human, whole, imperfect, and true is the rarest and most beautiful miracle that exists. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's what the universe has always needed.